When Kurt Russell turned 75 years old, sitting down for an intimate conversation, he decided it was finally time. For over 3 decades, he'd kept quiet about something that had been weighing on him, a story about his friend Val Kilmer that deserved to be told before it was too late. The two men had shared something extraordinary on the set of Tombstone back in 1993, something that went far beyond the typical Hollywood working relationship. It was a connection forged in the Arizona desert, built on mutual respect, dark humor, and an understanding that few people in the industry ever truly experience. But the real story, the one that nobody knew, was waiting to be revealed. Most people assumed that Kurt Russell's and Val Kilmer's on-screen chemistry in Tombstone was pure acting genius, a perfect collision of two talented performers at the height of their powers. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday felt so authentic, so emotionally raw, that audiences couldn't imagine anyone else playing those roles. The gunfights were choreographed to perfection, the dialogue delivered with conviction, and the underlying tension between the characters crackled with authenticity. What viewers didn't realize was that the real relationship happening behind those cameras was just as compelling as anything they saw on the final cut. Russell and Kilmer hadn't just become colleagues for a few months of filming. They developed something deeper, something that would last for the next 30 years. The rumors had started immediately after Tombstone's release. People in Hollywood whispered about the production, about how chaotic things had gotten when the original director was replaced halfway through shooting. They talked about creative conflicts, disagreements about the story direction, and tension between cast members. Some insisted that Russell and Kilmer had clashed constantly, that their famous on-screen chemistry masked a real-world friction. Others claimed they were inseparable, that they'd bonded so closely that they made everyone else on set feel like outsiders. The truth, as it always does, existed somewhere in between all those competing narratives. For decades, Russell had declined to comment on the specifics. When interviewers asked about his relationship with Kilmer, he'd give polite, measured responses that revealed nothing. He wasn't being cold or dismissive. He was simply protecting something sacred, something that belonged only to the two of them. But as Russell entered his mid-70s, he began to understand that the story was too important to leave untold. The world deserved to know what really happened between these two remarkable men during one of Hollywood's most legendary productions. What he finally decided to share would surprise almost everyone. It wasn't a tale of conflict or betrayal, though the production certainly had its share of drama. It wasn't a scandal or a secret struggle that had been hidden away. Instead, it was something far more meaningful, far more human, and ultimately far more beautiful than any of the rumors had suggested. It was a story about friendship, about two men who understood each other on a level that transcended the typical celebrity relationship. And it began with understanding exactly who these men were before they ever set foot in Tombstone, Arizona. Kurt Russell's journey to becoming one of Hollywood's most respected leading men began far earlier than most people realize. Born in Springfield, Massachusetts, in 1951, he was surrounded by entertainment from his earliest days. His father, Bing Russell, was a working actor who appeared in countless television shows and westerns throughout the 50s and 60s. His mother, Louise, had danced professionally before settling into family life. The Russell household wasn't just exposed to entertainment, it was practically woven into the fabric of everyday existence. When the family relocated to California during Kurt's childhood, moving to the quiet suburb of Thousand Oaks, young Russell found himself in a place where both dreams seemed possible. He could pursue acting like his father, or he could chase his genuine passion for baseball, a sport he loved with an intensity that rivaled his interest in performing. Throughout his teenage years, Russell lived a double life that few child actors ever managed successfully. While other young performers were struggling to choose between their careers and normal adolescence, Russell seemed determined to do everything. He appeared on television regularly, guest starring on shows like The Man from UNCL and Gilligan's Island. He made his film debut in 1963 and It Happened at the World's Fair, a movie that also featured a young performer named Elvis Presley. But while pursuing acting opportunities, Russell was equally committed to baseball. He played throughout high school and even signed a minor league contract, reaching Class AA before a shoulder injury in 1973 ended that particular dream. Rather than viewing this as a setback, Russell simply redirected his considerable energy toward acting. The 70s transformed Russell from a child star into a legitimate leading man. He worked extensively with director John Carpenter, creating iconic characters like Snake Plissken in Escape from New York. He demonstrated remarkable range by appearing in serious dramas, action films, and comedies. By the time the 80s arrived, Russell had already reinvented himself multiple times, proving that he wasn't trapped by his Disney image or his early television work. He was a versatile, intelligent performer who could handle virtually any role. Meanwhile, Val Kilmer was on his own trajectory, following a somewhat different path but with equal determination and talent. Val Kilmer grew up in Los Angeles, the son of a former actor and an entertainer mother. He attended Juilliard School, one of the most prestigious acting institutions in America, where he studied under the legendary John Houseman. While Russell had learned his craft through practical experience and constant work, Kilmer had received rigorous classical training. He emerged from Juilliard with exceptional range and a deep commitment to his craft. His early roles in films like Real Genius and Top Gun had already established him as a serious talent. He wasn't just good-looking, he was incredibly intelligent, deeply committed to understanding his characters, and willing to push himself in ways that other actors often avoided. By 1993, both men had already achieved significant success in their respective careers. Russell was a bankable star who could carry major productions. Kilmer was emerging as one of the most talented actors of his generation, someone who could disappear entirely into a character. Neither man needed the other to succeed. They weren't desperate young actors fighting for attention. They were established professionals at the height of their powers, which made their eventual connection all the more significant. The stage was set for something extraordinary to happen when they arrived in Arizona to begin filming Tombstone. The production of Tombstone became legendary almost immediately, but not for the reasons the filmmakers had initially hoped. Screenwriter Kevin Jarre, a talented writer who had done extensive research by actually living in Tombstone and attending cowboy camp to understand the period authentically, had been given the chance to direct his own script. It was a significant opportunity, the kind of break that many writers dream about but few actually receive. However, within weeks of filming beginning in the spring of 1993, it became clear that something wasn't working. Jarre, despite his passion and preparation, wasn't managing the creative demands of directing a major studio production. Scenes weren't being completed on schedule. Shooting days were slipping away. The budget was beginning to balloon. Studio executives grew increasingly nervous as the production fell further behind. The decision came relatively quickly, though it must have been devastating for Jarre. George P. Cosmatos, a veteran filmmaker with decades of experience, was brought in to take over the direction. This kind of mid-production replacement is never simple or painless. It sends shockwaves through the entire crew. Actors wonder what this means for their performances and the film's direction. Department heads question whether their work will be valued or completely redone. There's uncertainty, tension, and a natural resistance to change. Some cast members welcomed Cosmatos' arrival, viewing him as a steady hand who could rescue the production. Others questioned his vision and wondered whether he truly understood what Jarre had been building. The tension on set was palpable during those transition weeks. Beyond the directorial change, the screenplay itself was undergoing significant revision. Entire subplots that Jarre had written were being trimmed or eliminated entirely. Scenes were being rewritten by other hands. The romantic subplot between Wyatt Earp and Josephine Marcus, which had originally been substantial, was being reduced to something much smaller. These changes weren't made arbitrarily. Early test screenings suggested that audiences wanted a leaner, more focused story, one where the gunfights and the conflict took precedence over romantic entanglements. Still, for everyone involved in the production, these constant changes created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Nobody knew exactly what movie they were making anymore. Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell found themselves navigating this chaotic environment while simultaneously building their characters from the ground up. Kilmer was spending countless hours perfecting Doc Holliday's distinctive Southern accent and his lightning-fast draw. Russell was working with legendary firearms instructor Thel Reed as learning not just how to look convincing with period weapons but how to actually handle them the way a 19th-century lawman would have. Both men were deeply committed to authenticity, which meant they had to learn skills that most actors simply fake. They were preparing as if they were actually going to become these historical figures, not just pretend to be them. What's crucial to understand is that during this period of production chaos, Russell and Kilmer were essentially going through boot camp together. They attended the same 2-week intensive training session at Old Tucson Studios. They practiced horseback riding, gun handling, and frontier skills side by side. They watched each other work through the same challenges of embodying characters from a completely different era. They shared meals, stories, and the kind of intense bonding experience that only happens when people are pushed to their limits together. While the production around them was falling apart, while executives were panicking and crews were questioning the direction, these two men were forming something unbreakable. They were becoming allies in an increasingly difficult situation, partners in a shared vision. As filming continued through the Arizona heat, something remarkable happened. Rather than being torn apart by the production's chaos, Russell and Kilmer seemed to draw strength from it. They developed an unspoken understanding about what they were trying to accomplish together. Kilmer would watch Russell work through a particularly challenging gunfight sequence, and he'd offer subtle suggestions or observations. Russell would notice Kilmer struggling with a particular accent moment, and he'd share something he'd learned from his own preparation. They weren't competing with each other, they were lifting each other up. They were creating characters that complemented and challenged each other in ways that went far beyond what was written on the page. The on-screen chemistry that eventually captivated audiences wasn't manufactured or forced. It was genuine because the relationship behind the scenes was genuine. When Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday shared scenes together, there was a real history there, a real understanding of who these men were to each other. Kilmer brought an almost ethereal quality to Doc Holliday, making him simultaneously charming and haunting, witty and doomed. Russell brought a quiet strength to Wyatt Earp, a man trying to do the right thing in an increasingly complicated situation. Together, they created something that felt absolutely authentic, something that made audiences believe they were watching real events from the Old West unfold before their eyes. But the real revelation, the truth that Kurt Russell decided to share at 75, came at the very end of filming. As the production wrapped and cast members began saying their goodbyes, there was an unofficial tradition of exchanging gifts. It wasn't required or expected, but it had become a meaningful way of acknowledging the extraordinary experience everyone had shared. Russell wanted to do something special for Kilmer, something that would capture the unique connection they developed. So he did something that seemed impossible at first. He tracked down Kilmer's costume pieces from the film, including his iconic holster, his gun, his hat, and even his personalized chair from the set. He had these items photographed and arranged in a way that would be meaningful and surprising. But those weren't the actual gifts. That was just the presentation. The real gift was something far more audacious and darkly humorous. Russell purchased Val Kilmer a burial plot at Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona, the historic graveyard where many legendary Old West figures were actually buried. It was a dark joke, certainly, but it was also something more. It was a reference to Doc Holliday's inevitable fate, a connection between the character Kilmer had brilliantly portrayed and the man himself. It acknowledged mortality, the passage of time, and the shared understanding that they'd created something that would outlive them both. It was funny and morbid and deeply meaningful all at once. When Kilmer opened the gift, he immediately understood what Russell had done. Rather than laughing and moving on, Kilmer made a gesture that Russell would never forget. He instructed his own driver to bring out the gift he'd prepared for Russell. Without any coordination, without knowing what the other man had chosen, Kilmer had arrived at a remarkably similar idea. He'd purchased for Kurt Russell not just a burial plot, but an entire acre of land overlooking Boot Hill Cemetery. Two men, independent of each other, had both chosen to give gifts centered on death and the Old West. It was as if they'd been thinking on the exact same wavelength, operating from the same emotional and intellectual understanding of what their time together had meant. Section 5: Emotional Resolution and Call to Action. When Russell later reflected on that moment, he realized something profound had happened. Doc Holliday had always been associated with death, with a man living on borrowed time, knowing that tuberculosis was slowly consuming him. Wyatt Earp, by contrast, represented life, resilience, and the determination to survive and move forward. Their gift exchange had somehow perfectly mirrored those characters. Kilmer's gift of land that overlooked the cemetery suggested Russell's enduring legacy, his ability to watch over and transcend mortality itself. Russell's gift of a burial plot for Kilmer acknowledged the character he'd created, the role that would define how people remembered him. It was poetry in physical form, a conversation between two artists about legacy, mortality, and the meaning of what they'd created together. For 30 years after that moment, Russell carried the memory of that exchange. He thought about it during his subsequent successes, during the times when his and Kilmer's paths diverged and they went on to other projects. Russell continued working steadily, appearing in films like Stargate, Death Proof, and The Hateful Eight, and eventually joining the Marvel Universe. Kilmer also continued working, taking on increasingly challenging roles that showcased his remarkable range and intelligence. They didn't need to stay in constant contact. They didn't need to remind each other that something special had existed between them. The friendship was there, solid and real, existing beneath the surface of their public lives. Then, in 2014, Kilmer faced a health crisis that would test his resilience in ways that Wyatt Earp himself might have understood. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, a disease that threatened not just his life but also his ability to speak, to act, and to do the thing he loved most. For a man who had spent his career using his voice as an instrument of extraordinary precision and power, this diagnosis was almost incomprehensibly difficult. But Kilmer fought back. He underwent treatment, and while he emerged from that battle changed, his spirit remained unbroken. He continued acting, adapting to his new reality, proving once again that he possessed the same quiet strength that had made his portrayal of Doc Holliday so unforgettable. Russell watched his friend struggle from a distance, deeply affected by Kilmer's determination and grace in the face of such adversity. Years passed. Kilmer rebuilt his career, appeared in new projects, and demonstrated that cancer couldn't diminish his talent or his presence. Then, on April 1, 2025, Russell learned that Kilmer had passed away at the age of 65. Pneumonia had taken him, just as consumption had taken the real Doc Holliday so many years before. The news struck Russell deeply. His friend, his co-star, the man with whom he'd shared one of the most meaningful creative experiences of his life, was gone. In choosing to share this story at 75, Russell wasn't just reminiscing about the past. He was honoring a friendship that had meant everything to him. He was ensuring that people understood that behind every great film, behind every unforgettable performance, there are real human connections. There are moments of genuine understanding between artists who recognize something special in each other. There are gifts exchanged that mean far more than their material value. There are memories that sustain us across decades and outlive us all. What was your favorite moment from Tombstone? What scene still stays with you after all these years? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one.